Hey, welcome back, everyone. So, some good stories to go over tonight. Quite a few, actually. We're going to be talking about how the special election in Texas turned out. Actually, it turned out that the Democrats came up with about a third of the vote when it came to this, which is making them reconsider some of the policies they're pushing and also looking more towards 2022. This is being taken as kind of a sign of what could happen in 2022. We're going to go into that, also going into some updates on the Ashley Babbitt case, the woman who was shot by Capitol Police during the January 6th protest at the Capitol. Also going into how Biden's going to be pushing his tax program globally. And so, folks, even if you're in Europe, even if you're outside the U.S., Biden's corporate tax policy could be coming your way. We'll have to see what happens with it. Quite a few stuff going on. Also, some new updates on the Fusion GPS scandal. I'm sure everyone remembers the Trump-Russia, right? Everyone remembers this story about how Trump colluded with Russia and how the whole thing turned out to be basically media make-believe. We have some updates on that now, including financing behind the organization that put that whole scandal together. It turns out there was a billionaire-backed operative who continued funding Christopher Steele, who was doing this, who was putting this disinformation together, and ties to Soros, ties to some other key players. We'll be going into that as well. Now, folks, that said, good to see you all. Yeah. Gary S., good to see you. Thank you. Yeah, folks. Yeah, Roseanne Dunn, hi from California. Good. Thanks for being here. Yeah, folks, good to see you all as always. Richard, yeah, good evening, Josh. Dennis, yeah, thank you. Yeah, Monica, yeah, everyone. Yeah, always a pleasure, folks. Now, that said, if you have any questions, leave them in the chat. I'll try to get to them around the halfway point. And that said, let's jump into the first story for the night. Now, first off, Epoch Times reports losing Texas candidate issues warning 2022 could be major setback for Democrats. And this is a Democrat saying this. Now, the Epoch Times reports a Democratic candidate who lost her bid during last week's Texas congressional special election sounded the alarm that the 2022 midterms, the elections coming up in about a year, where Trump is pushing right now to retake the House and the Senate for Republicans. This Democrat candidate saying it could be a major setback for the Democratic Party. Now, during the special election in Texas, 2 Republicans and no Democrats advanced in the runoff as the top 2 vote getters in the race for Texas's 6th congressional district after no one in the 23 candidate field won an outright majority of votes on May 1st. Democrat Jana Lynn Sanchez finished 3rd with 13% and conceded on May 2nd. She said this after that. 13%, folks. She said, quote, on Saturday, Republican candidates got 62% of the vote to 38% for Democrats. Allegedly, like 25%, 25-point increase, right? And all the things I thought would motivate Democrats, such as the attempted violent overthrow of a legitimate election result, along with Snowmageddon, as they're calling it, failed to get our voters out. And so what she's saying basically is the crises that the media is leveraging, the January 6th protest at the Capitol, where people entered the Capitol, really walked around, and Capitol Police shot and killed one of the protesters, right? They're saying that the narratives they're pushing around that are not enough, basically, to get Democrat voters to the polls. Also, what they're calling Snowmageddon, the freezing over in Texas where many people did die, they're saying that the Democrat framing of that is also not working for them. And so what she's saying here now is saying it failed to get our voters out. And she said this, I'm sounding the alarm bell. If Democrats don't organize and prepare, 2022 could be a major setback to our gains of recent years. Now, the interesting thing we have coming up with 2022 isn't just different states putting into place new requirements for election security. We've seen many Republican states, and keep in mind when it comes to the local state legislatures, they oftentimes do have a Republican majority state by state, many states across the U.S. A lot of them now are working on putting new standards in place for election integrity, including in some states, voter ID. Now, Democrats are framing that as voter suppression, although frankly, what does not require an ID these days? And they're pretty flexible with that as well. It can be pretty much most forms of ID are typically accepted. It's not like you need a special voting ID or anything like that. Just some kind of proof that you are who you claim you are. Many states are putting that into place. Democrats are very unhappy about it for the most part. At the same time, you have them rolling back a lot of the additional abilities, let's say, that different mayors created during the 2020 elections. Basically, what happened in a lot of states is that the mayors in different states or the governors in different states bypassed the state legislatures using emergency protocols, right? Using emergency powers because of the pandemic, because of the virus, to give themselves powers to, basically over the election in ways that they normally would not have it. In other words, put simply, they, instead of doing things that were illegal, because they did things legally in a lot of places, but they changed the laws in order to make illegal things legal, right? Things that were normally illegal, they changed the laws to allow themselves to do. And in doing so, they also bypassed, in many states, the state legislatures and put these in place. Arguably, well, technically unconstitutional what they did, but who's holding them accountable at this point? Now, you have that, and then you have, of course, the different crises the Democrats are pushing. And typically the Democrat line, really through most of the Trump years, was basically, we're not Trump. Trump's the bad guy, and that was the narrative they were running on. Now, what is the narrative? We're seeing now Biden in power. We're seeing the Democrats with really a supermajority. And people are seeing the kinds of actions that they will carry out when they have the ability to do anything they want, essentially. And it seems to be the case that watching them do whatever they want is not something that gets Democrat voters to the polls. And also not having a tangible enemy, it seems, right? Someone to point people to say, this is your enemy, go after them. The most they're doing right now is the Capitol protest on January 6th. The most they're doing is using that to push forward the narratives and claiming that somehow Republicans were responsible for the snowstorm in Texas, which many people died under, arguably caused by the power grid switching to clean fuels, wind turbines and such, which ended up freezing. Now, folks, that said, coming up to 2022, Trump is going to be pushing very soon, very likely, on his campaigns. And he's going to be backing the different candidates on the Republican ticket, specifically on the MAGA ticket. Technically, going into 2022, we have three different political parties. You have the establishment, Democrat and Republican parties, the old school ones, right? What they call the Rhino Republicans and the Democrats, which have really been infiltrated a lot by the socialist, undercurrents. And then you have the MAGA party, Trump's party. And Trump now is basically leading the way for the Republican Party and trying to push out what he calls the rhinos. These individuals who he says, claim to be Republican, but are Republican in name only, rhino. Now, we'll have to see what happens, folks, and I'll keep you all updated on this. As I mentioned, very likely, very soon, we're going to see this start. Now, this Democrat candidate is saying if Democrats don't organize and prepare, right, for 2022, they could see basically their gains get taken away. Organize and prepare. And if we're talking about community organizing here, for the first time I can ever think of, Republicans are also looking to do the same. Trump is talking about community organizing, talking about organizing his MAGA rallies to get behind local candidates. And you're going to see a lot of movement on this very likely very soon. Now, I'll keep you all updated on this. That said, folks, now I mentioned before, Crossroads is totally demonetized on YouTube. Of course, we've now set up Epoch TV. I'll be telling you about a bit more about that later. But folks, we also have some sponsors who've helped us keep going. And one of them tonight's episode is brought to you by American Hartford Gold. And with all the turbulence with the economy, like $6 trillion in government spending, for example, the stock market, risks of inflation, which they're now talking about openly, you can consider investing in an asset that tends to be stable and is often also on the incline, that is gold and silver. American Hartford Gold is one of the highest rated firms in the country with an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau. They can have your gold and silver delivered right to your doorstep or into your IRA. To learn more, please check out the link we have in the description, where American Hartford Gold is providing a free 25-page information guide. And folks, even if you just want to learn about investing in gold and silver, check out that information guide again in our description. If you call them now as well, you can get up to $1,500 of free silver on all qualifying first orders. The phone number for that is 877-260-2764 on the screen here. Or you can text Joshua to 65532. Yeah. Anyways, folks, economy is not looking that stable, to say the least, right now. And just generally speaking, gold and silver do tend to be fairly stable and typically, again, on the incline. You're dealing with, foundational currencies, hard currencies that are not they're not controlled within the spectrum of, let's say, overprinting money and causing inflation or multi-trillion-dollar spending packages. Gold and silver tend to be pretty decently stable, some of the most stable. Now, that said, folks, let's go over a few more stories, and then we'll jump into some questions for the night. The tea tonight, by the way, is a British black tea. One of you all sent me. It's quite nice. All right, folks. Now, you remember we mentioned before during the January 6th protests, really it was more of a walkthrough, and you even had police, Capitol Police, opening up the barriers, literally waving people in. We have staff personally who saw this happening, opening the barriers, literally waving people into the building, telling them, come on in, essentially. There's videos of it. Many people walked through the building. There was really the violence that was committed, other than some yelling, was against a woman named Ashley Babbitt, shot by Capitol Police. Now, the story, of course, Officer Sicknick, people said that he was assaulted, turned out to have been a lie. The media lied in order to make these appear to have been, violent protests. The only person who was killed by a Capitol Police officer. Officer Sicknick died of natural causes, and even it's now turning out that the narrative they were pushing, not only was he not killed by protesters, as the media, mainstream media, was claiming and lying to all of you, but he also was not, in fact, sprayed by bear spray, which was the other lie they were peddling. But folks, there's new information coming out with Ashley Babbitt, and the family is now looking possibly to sue Capitol Police. This is raising some other issues with the transparency of Capitol Police, and also some inquiries into what actually happened with the security on the Capitol on January 6th. Security which individuals like Nancy Pelosi would normally have been in charge of. And folks, you right now have the folks who should technically be figures of investigation, subjects of investigation, trying themselves to lead the investigations. And not saying she's guilty, but just saying that anybody who had any part in it, if they want to investigate it, should be part of the investigation, not leading the investigations. But folks, one part of this is now coming out. Epoch Times reports this. Officer who shot Ashley Babbitt on January 6th didn't issue warnings first, according to her lawyer, or the family's lawyer. It says this. The lawyer for the family of Ashley Babbitt, the woman who was killed by a Capitol Police officer during the January 6th Capitol breach, said that witnesses did not hear the officer give a warning before he shot her. And there's actually a video of this. In the video, there's also not a warning. Now, the officer, who has not yet been identified, was cleared by federal prosecutors of any wrongdoing in the shooting. In other words, cleared by the same folks within his own camp, federal prosecutors, right? Cleared to them, saying it was reasonable that the officer fired in self-defense. She was not attacking him. He had at least 5 armed police officers right next to her. And so the narrative is being questioned. It says here, the officer's attorney, Mark Schammel, told news outlets his client did, in fact, warn Babbitt and others who were behind the door attempting to get into the chamber of the House of Representatives. And this is the officer's lawyer saying this. They're claiming it's a false narrative that he issued no verbal commands or warnings. And he told this to news outlets last month, adding that witness statements corroborate his account, and claims he was screaming, stay back, Don't come in here. However, it's coming out now a different story on this. Babbitt's family lawyer, Terrell Roberts, appeared to dispute that account. And Roberts told journalist Cheryl Atkinson on May 2nd, a well-respected investigative journalist, the lawyer is now saying this, quote, "They didn't hear any kind of warning. I think a reasonable officer would know, given the noise on the other side of the door, that anything that he's saying would not be heard." In other words, regardless of whether he was saying this, nobody was hearing it. And again, two individuals, very shady looking, smashed the window after telling the officers, at least two armed police officers who were standing right in front of the door, to move to the side while they did it. And while 2 to 3 heavily armed officers, sorry, forgive me for the noise outside, 2 to 3 heavily armed officers were coming up the stairs right behind her. In other words, you had at least 4 to 5, maybe even 6 armed officers right next to her. And they watched this individual break the window. They watched the individual leave, go down the stairs and change his clothes, meaning it might have been premeditated. And then they watched Ashley Babbitt, an unarmed woman, climb through that window and get shot in the neck as she was climbing through. And folks, we also watched how the media lied about this, how the media lied as well about the alleged, murder, as they claimed originally, of Officer Sicknick, claiming he was killed by protesters. Nobody was killed by protesters. The only person killed was Ashley Babbitt, who was killed by that officer on the other side of that door, whose name we do not know, who is really not, information's being withheld on this. And folks, we'll have to see what happens with it. Now, that said, it appears that Republicans are looking into some of what happened on January 6th as well. Epoch Times reports this: House Republicans request hearing with Capitol Police Board for first time in 76 years. Epoch Times reports 3 House Republicans are looking to hold a series of hearings, not just one, concerning the U.S. Capitol Police Board in the wake of the lapses that contributed to the January 6th breach of the U.S. Capitol. And folks, looking into, in other words, the security that was at the building at the time. How did people breach the building while Trump was still giving his speech near the Washington Monument? Trump was still giving his speech when people began breaching the Capitol, which challenges the whole idea that they used to impeach him, claiming that Trump's statements were what instigated the crowd when people, as he was still speaking, were already breaching it. Why, for example, did the local officials there turn down Trump's offer to have the National Guard present? Why did they not take Trump's offer on that? And remember, folks, when you had the National Guard called in later, that was Trump calling in the National Guard. But why did they reject that officer? How many people were present at the building when people were breaching it as Trump was speaking, if the majority of the crowd was still at Trump's event? How did they get into the building? And why were officers opening up the barriers and waving people into the building? All of these things are questions that should be answered, especially if we have the president right now, Biden, claiming this was the worst attack on America, since 9/11 or whatever he's claiming now. All right. Anyways, folks, let's go into a bit more. In an April 29 letter addressed to Committee on House Administration Chairwoman Zoe Zofgren, who's a Democrat from California, Representatives Rodney Davis, a Republican, Barry Loudermilk, Republican, and Brian Steele, Republican, asked that all 3 members of the Capitol Police Board testify before lawmakers, the first such appearance since 1945. And folks, let's see what comes out from this, right? We're going to see what comes out from this, because we're going to see what caused the low security protocols that were being practiced at the Capitol building on January 6th. And again, who is in charge of security on January 6th? Which public officials were the ones who were making these calls? Which public officials might have given stand-down notices to the police? Which public officials were not really doing anything to, let's say, up the ante on security? And which public officials turned down Trump's offer for additional security? All these things need to be answered, folks. And again, they're calling for investigations. It's good to see that the investigation is looking at all sides of this. Now, another story here We'll go into a couple more, then we'll go into some questions for the night. The Biden administration is pushing higher taxes, not just in the United States, but possibly globally as well. And so even if you're outside the United States and you own a business, you may start feeling the weight of Biden's pressure to raise your taxes. Let's go into it. White House economic advisor says global minimum corporate levy needed to offset Biden's tax increase. Remember, folks, the Biden administration is looking to be spending already about $6 trillion in spending packages, about four times the U.S. budget in a normal cycle. And part of this, again, is this new infrastructure plan they're pushing, these new plans they're pushing, which they're planning to finance around $1.6 trillion, looking to finance by raising corporate taxes. Now, one of the big concerns people have is, well, if you raise corporate taxes, they're just going to leave the country. Businesses will just leave the country. And so what's the Biden administration's plan for this? Well, make sure that if they leave the country, the other countries will charge them the same amount of money. In other words, you can no longer escape high taxes. That's the plan. We'll have to see if it works. Let's go into it. Epoch Times reports Celia Rose, chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, said the Biden administration continues to urge its trading partners to adopt a global minimum tax on corporations to offset the effects of President Joe Biden's proposed domestic corporate tax increase. And she said this: the idea is to make sure that corporations are paying their fair share, to button up some of the loopholes, which have meant more corporations were actually putting more money offshores, off of U.S. soil, and having a good minimum tax so that we're working with the rest of our trading partners, so that we're working with the rest of the world, so that corporations are paying their fair share worldwide. Now, folks, in other words, the ability for them to pay for their proposed spending bills is dependent on them being able to make sure that corporations can't escape paying these taxes. And because they can't really stop them from leaving the country, right, from putting their businesses offshore and becoming foreign businesses, the Biden administration's approach is to try to make U.S. trading partners raise their corporate taxes. Now, how many countries in the world do you think are going to follow along with the U.S. plan in doing this? How many countries in the world do you think are going to be willing to tax not just American businesses fleeing the United States, but even their own businesses, right? At the very least, not all of these countries. And what does that mean? It means the countries that choose not to do this, like China very likely, like many U.S. adversaries very likely, like most of Latin America very likely, are going to have a significant benefit over the United States and over Europe when the cost of doing business becomes very, very high. And this is at the same time when many companies are looking as well to possibly partnering with the Chinese Communist Party, especially with its new digital currency, to get out of the US dollar. Now, if they're pushing this right now, and the Chinese Communist Party is pushing an alternative to the US dollar, do you think U.S. trading partners are going to say, let's go with the U.S. dollar while Biden puts into place, $6 trillion in spending, which means inflation of the U.S. dollar, which they already acknowledge is going to be happening, while at the same time making it so that businesses have to pay such a huge amount of money that they may want to flee the United States, and the only way they can continue afford to pay for their over-budgeted expenses is to make other countries change their tax policies. Do you think other countries are going to go along with it and put their, all their eggs in one basket of the U.S. dollar, which is seeing right now a whole lot of really unresponsible spending that is dependent on their ability to make the whole world essentially change its tax policies in order for it to work? A pipe dream. But at the very least, what they're looking at is making U.S. trading partners change their tax policies. And folks, let's see how that goes. A lot of U.S. trading partners that would do that are typically already doing that to some extent. Many parts of Europe, for example, already have pretty high corporate tax policies. Some don't. But what's going to happen, they're probably not going to be able to enforce it in every single country, and whichever country they don't enforce it in, which is probably going to be many still, are going to be very likely where the big businesses flee, which means the people bearing the burden for the corporate taxes are going to be the small and medium-sized corporations. And keep in mind, folks, corporation doesn't mean big business necessarily. A lot of people, most people who run businesses incorporate for the legal protections. Even your local, 7-Eleven, well, maybe not that example, even your local, corner store or your local taco shop, they probably are registered as a corporation for the legal protections because it makes it so it's not under your name, right? A lot of people do it for legal protections and for other benefits. This means, folks, the small and medium businesses very likely will shoulder most of this. And if the success of Biden being able to pay for these spending packages is dependent on the big businesses not fleeing the country, which they're not going to build and force globally, that means as well the U.S. dollar is going to get hit pretty hard. Very likely, they're already acknowledging we're going to see inflation. Not to mention, many small and medium businesses are already seeing weight from the lockdowns. Right? They're already seeing the weight from the lockdowns. And really, only the big businesses have been able to weather this, let's say, decently for the most part. Really, folks, it's not looking so hot. And the timing of this is when the Chinese Communist Party, again, is pushing its new digital currency as an alternative to the US dollar and pushing that globally, including very likely on some of the same countries where the Biden administration is trying to get them to raise their corporate taxes. What do you think is going to happen, folks? Right? Your guess is as good as mine, but frankly, I don't think they're going to have a good shot at getting many countries on board with it. And even if they get all of Europe on board with it, that's still, and maybe a couple, probably no countries in Latin America, probably no countries in Africa, and probably very few in Asia. Their ability to get countries on board with this are very slim. Let's put it that way. We'll have to see how it goes. I'll keep you all updated on as we go forward. Now, I want to go into some updates on Fusion GPS. There's some very, very interesting new findings that are coming out on who was behind the Trump-Russia scandal. Specifically, folks, who was financing it, who was putting in, let's say, millions upon millions of dollars into a scandal that was spreading disinformation across the country and was being used politically against Trump during that time and was used by our federal agencies to illegally spy on the Trump campaign. While many folks were tied to it, let's say billionaire-backed operatives were behind it. Now, I'll go into that in just a bit, but first, folks, let's go over some questions for the night. Let's see here. And so, folks, again, if you have questions, leave them in the chat. I'll try to get to them. First question is from Pastor Kenny. He said, "Good evening, Josh." Yeah, pleasure. Thank you. He said, "Question, do you have any news on the CIA breach?" I do not, actually. I don't have any updates on that. We'll have to see what comes out from it. This is from IT Umblers. He said, "Where's the book list?" So I can't remember which day it was. Recently, I did do a short book list towards the end of one of the lives. We'll see, folks. We have a few special features to go through, but I want to do a more comprehensive book list for you all still. I did publish a book list on some recommended reading a few, maybe a couple weeks ago or a week ago. And so I wish I remember which episode it was, but it was in one of the recent episodes. We did do the book list towards the end of it, mainly focused on kind of giving a background on communism. I will work on something more comprehensive, though, because I want to do something a little higher quality, right? Maybe we can go through a few different book categories or something like that. In the meantime, though, I have a few different projects I'm working on. I did mention the communism series. The series talked about the origins of communism. That's been put slightly on hold. We're still working on it very quickly, but I have a couple other projects you should be hearing about soon, which we're trying to push through a bit faster. And so hopefully soon I'll have some big updates for you on that as well. But we're working on this, folks. Molly John, you said, "Is Jack Phillips of the Epoch Times a relative of yours?" Jack Phillips is a very prolific writer with the Epoch Times. He and I are not related, though. His last name is Phillips. Mine is Phillipp. Maybe if we go further back, far back enough in history, it's very likely the names might have had the same origin. Actually, I can trace the Philip name back to, some of the early Crusades, actually, and so very likely, his maybe we're distant relatives or something like that. But no, we're not technically related. This is from Betsy Price. She said, "What's going on with Trump's fundraising? Who controls WinRed?" I haven't heard of WinRed. Now, there's a few different issues that Trump's been having, namely people trying to use his image and to use his name in order to get donations. Right now, 45office.com is Trump's main way of going about this, right? Sorry. We see Trump right now pushing his PAC, right, and pushing the MAGA movement. There are a lot of organizations that are trying to use his name and use his likeness. Remember that he even tried suing, or at least threatened, the RNC, the Republican National Committee, for using his likeness. And so it does seem to be the case there are some groups trying to use the Trump persona in order to get donations and push things forward. I'm not personally sure if WinRed is actually under Trump or under someone else. But as things go forward, we'll be getting some more information on this. Yeah, is a CHKN2NY says the RNC is using his name. Yeah, they basically come out and said that they have the right to do it. And so they basically told Trump, we're going to do it no matter what, whether you like it or not. Yeah, but we'll have to see, folks. It doesn't seem to be the case that many Republicans are very happy with the Republican National Committee. And let's go back to what happened after Trump left office, right? Basically, it seemed to be the case that the Republicans were trying to go back to the way things were before, right? You had them coming out and basically saying that Trump needs to get behind the Republican Party. Trump needs to get behind the Republican Party if Republicans are going to win. They need cohesion. They need things to calm down. That was the idea. What does Trump do? He says, no, you get behind me. This is my party now, essentially. And Trump then created his own super PAC, his own political action committee, which he's now going to be using to place his own candidates under the MAGA movement. In other words, Trump still having majority influence over the Republican Party in terms of voters is basically putting his own candidates into play and saying, this is my party now. You folks want to get right. You folks want to get into positions. You want me to campaign for you. You want me to endorse you. You're going to have to hold the MAGA agenda, the Trump agenda. And so that's the way things have gone. Now, the Republican National Committee side of it, of course, they're still at play. They're still doing their thing. And they're trying, I think, to deal with Trump coming onto the scene and pushing a separate agenda from what the Republicans, I think, really intended happening. People talk about rhinos, Republican in name only. It really, I think what you're seeing is a different Republican Party that has taken over. This is now really the Trump Party leading the way on the Republican side. And this is of the Republicans who didn't technically switch sides over to the Democrats, like your George Bushes and so on. Let's see here. This is from Jay Tay. He said, hey, Josh, did you hear Trump is going back on Facebook tomorrow? Is this true? So Facebook is reviewing whether they should give Trump his access back to Facebook. They're doing a review on whether they should let him back on. Now, I can just give my own analysis on this, take it for what it's worth. I think the timing of this is interesting. Now, typically a lot of things that happen are not by chance. Typically, there's a lot of strategy and thinking behind things. Remember how Parler was kicked off the Apple App Store, it kicked off Amazon Web Services, Parler being the social media website used heavily by conservatives. Remember they got kicked off. It seemed like they'd never get back on, and Parler's business was essentially destroyed overnight before they made kind of a slow comeback, slowly getting back to where they were before. They're on the track now. Do you remember what happened around the time when it was announced that they could, for example, get back on the App Store? Do you remember the context of that? It was right when Mike Lindell was supposed to launch his social media. Right when Mike Lindell was supposed to be launching Frank. And of course, Mike Lindell launched the page for that. As of now, last I've seen, it's not yet functioning. He's using it to publish his investigative videos on the elections, on irregularities on the elections, right? That's what he's using it for currently. What are the chances that the folks at Apple said, oh, look, let's just give them access back. Oh, it has nothing to do with Mike Lindell possibly launching a competitor to our platform that may take a whole bunch of our market share overnight. Do you think that was the case, or do you think it was, oh, hey, Mike Lindell's about to launch this platform that's very likely going to take a lot of our users and very likely cause serious competition? Why don't we allow competition within their own user base to make sure it doesn't divide us as badly? Which of these two do you think it might have been? At the very least, we can say the timing was very, say, coincidental. And now, folks, what is happening now that they're considering letting Trump back onto Facebook and maybe other platforms? We're right at the time now where Trump said that he would very likely be releasing, or at least Trump's top advisors, people close to him. Trump didn't say it himself as far as I saw. People very close to Trump said that Trump would be launching his own social media in about 2 to 3 months, they said, and that was about 2 months ago. In other words, we're right around the time as we speak that Trump's alleged social media, we'll have to see what happens with it, should be going public. And what's going to happen, folks? If Trump releases his social media and that turns into something functioning, and then Trump makes his debut on there and begins organizing his MAGA protests or MAGA rallies, again, backing different candidates for 2022, if he begins organizing protests as he said he's going to be doing, as he begins with grassroots organizing, community organizing, which he said he's going to be doing, and going to need an online platform to do it, like Facebook groups or another similar platform, he's going to need something for that. Whichever platform he announces for that, whichever platform he chooses to use for that, is going to be the platform everybody goes to for that movement. Now, do you think he's going to go to Facebook for that? A platform that has been deleting people's pages, deleting people's groups, censoring people, and otherwise based on political biases. It's been proven by now. I would say the chances are very slim. But very likely they're doing this because two things are on the horizon. And again, we can only say so much about what their intentions are, but my analysis, right? Two things are on the horizon right now. We're right about at the time when Trump said he'd be releasing his social network. Mike Lindell's platform, Frank, very likely could be online very soon. We'll have to see what happens with it. And we'll have to see if Trump chooses to use it or make his own platform. But regardless of those possibilities, what we can say is that Trump's grassroots movement for 2022 and the different elections of 2022 is right around the corner. And we're going to see him starting to get involved with that very soon, meaning he's going to need a place to go. Do you think it's coincidental now that Facebook is offering this, right, to make them basically the hub for that movement rather than, say, a competitor, or rather say something they cannot censor if they want to politically? You tell me, folks. At the very least, we can say the timing is very interesting, right? The timing is very coincidental. Let's put it that way. Now, that said, folks, I mentioned before, for a while now, we have something big in the works, again, because we've been censored by YouTube, totally demonetized by YouTube. The reason why we don't have, for example, Super Chat on here, the reason you're not seeing ads on here, we're totally demonetized by YouTube, right? They're not giving us anything right now. And I told you, folks, we're working on something big, hopefully to get around the censorship. Now that something big is released, and that is epochtv.com, EPOCH TV.com. Show you a quick trailer of what we have in the works right now.
The year 1619 is not a year that wasn't known. The editors, Nicole Hannah-Jones, pretend that this is a long lost secret of American history, and we're going to tell you, and we're going to explain what happened that year. And so we need to replace 1776 with 1619 because that's when the first Africans came here.
How is that narrative false?
It wasn't that. Jefferson repeatedly tried to, and the other colonies, they tried to get England to stop sending over slaves. They said, no, we don't want to buy any more slaves, cut off the slave trade.
Now, folks, if you want to support Crossroads, please go to epochtv.com. Really, this is the way we're going to be hopefully keeping the show, keeping the show going in the future, is Epoch TV. This is a platform that cannot be censored. This is a platform we control. something they can't censor, something they can't kick us off of, something they can't demonetize us on. It's supported by folks like you. It's subscription-based, $4.99 a month, right? About the cost of a latte, or gallon of gas in California, maybe. So I like to joke. But folks, if you want to support us, please, please, please consider supporting us on Epoch TV. We have the exclusive interview there with Mary Grabar, a fantastic author. Actually, anybody looking for a good book to read, check out Debunking Howard Zinn by Mary Grabar. Fantastic book. Now, those of you who are not familiar with Howard Zinn, basically he was a communist in his early years, right? Claims to have renounced it in some regards, but it's questionable. He wrote a book called The People's History of the United States, which was actually debunked by a lot of historians at his time. Debunked by a lot of historians at the time for using a lot of unethical ways of basically twisting facts and so on. If you, for example, think that Christopher Columbus was chopping off the hands of people for gold and murdering people and was a savage and, evil white man, bad, or whatever it was, you're probably reading Howard Zinn's version of that history. Now, Howard Zinn used many severely unethical ways of framing those false narratives about Christopher Columbus, including, for example, taking Christopher Columbus's journal and beginning, a sentence on one page, quoting him starting on one page, and then doing an ellipsis like ... like you're continuing a statement, flipping several pages later and continuing the sentence several pages later, not a few words later, but several pages later, totally altering the context of what he was talking about in order to manufacture quotes that did not really exist. That was one of the many ways that Howard Zinn falsified the history of the United States. And that falsified history that he has is what's used in a lot of textbooks these days. It's what's taught in a lot of schools these days. It's what things like the 1619 Project heavily pull from. And so if you want to check out the interview we have with Mary Grabar talking about this, talking about some other issues with Howard Zinn with the 1619 Project, check out the exclusive interview we have with her on epochtv.com, EPOCH TV.com. And one more question, and then we'll go into some more stories for the night. This is from M. He said, Josh, by the way things are heading, do you think there will be a World War III, and we all end up getting blown up? Or do you think things will calm down over time? Well, I would say the nature of war has changed. Do I think there's going to be a World War III and there's going to be a hot war and we're all going to get blown up? No, I don't personally think that. I do think we can see regional wars. I think the chance of the Chinese Communist Party possibly trying to invade Taiwan and the U.S. getting pulled into a proxy war with that if we choose to fight, I'd say it's moderate. There's a moderate chance of that. The chance of the Chinese Communist Party pulling strings with Iran and restarting, for example, terror wars, for example, financing or giving weapons to Al-Qaeda or other terrorist organizations, giving money to narco-terror groups in Latin America and drawing us into some conflicts. I think it's very likely we're going to see that. But are we going to have World War III? I personally do not think so. And I'd say it's because of this. Basically, at least not for the short term, maybe 2049 when the Chinese military is up to standard where they want it to be, maybe. Prior to that, though, as of right now, and if the U.S. can do something about it, which they still can, and as long as other countries can do something about it, which they still can, I don't think we're going to see that unless many more things go wrong. But I do think we're going to see a lot of unconventional warfare. And war, it sounds cheesy these days, but war actually has changed quite a bit. I know people say, war never changes. War has changed quite a bit. The Chinese Communist Party wages what they call unrestricted warfare. And this is basically a different way of war fighting. It's a totally different way of thinking about conflict. Now, this is how it works. If you were the Chinese Communist Party, or if you were any country, for example, and you wanted to, let's say, conquer another adversary or conquer another country, How would you do it if you were to not use tanks and bombs and guns and jets and planes, right? You don't want to get into a hot war, because doing that would have the full weight of the international militaries, the United States and probably NATO or other U.S. allies, on top of you really quick, and you probably couldn't win that battle. What do? You use a couple things. One is called short of war tactics. In other words, you push things right to the brim of what would constitute war, but you never cross that line. Because typically you know what would constitute war for the United States. You know where that line is, you don't cross it. The other thing you do is you look at what would you get from war? What would you get if you were to if China were to conquer the United States? What would they get out of it, right? What would they have to gain from that? Well, economic dominance, political control, narrative control, media control, censorship, other things like this. How can you accomplish those goals without engaging in warfare? Right? Now, it takes the form of things like economic warfare, culture warfare, media warfare, legal warfare, control of legal systems, economic warfare, control of the GDP, right? GDP industries, like what they're doing in, for example, New Zealand, buying up, for example, the dairy fields, like they're doing, for example, in Australia, buying up the iron ore, like they're doing, for example, in most of Latin America, buying up all the natural resources, the oil, and so on. Like they're trying to do in different parts of the United States, like they did against Japan, controlling rare earth minerals, right? Resource warfare, environmental warfare. These are categories they list. Culture warfare, controlling things like Hollywood, which they're doing. Media warfare, controlling outlets of information, which they're doing, right? Things like the United Front. Many different categories of this. You can talk, I mean, really, the list could go on and on and on. There's roughly, I think, 20-something categories they have just openly listed within their unrestricted warfare doctrine. And it basically, another way of thinking about it, just to simplify it, is everything the government controls, which in China is everything, is weaponized. Whether that's foreign investment, whether that's study abroad programs of students, things like the Confucius Institutes, things like the Chinese Student and Scholar Associations, which they run. Things like bribery programs for U.S. professors, things like bribery programs for professors in other countries, Australia, Canada, Europe, you name it. Programs to subvert local politicians, programs to basically carry out lobbying on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party under the guise of, say, business interest or sister city programs and things like this. Many things they could do to get people in their pockets, essentially, and to manipulate the open systems of foreign countries. They have a word for this, which is strangle you with your own systems, a phrase for it. Strangle you with your own systems. That's what they call it. And this is where things are heading. The other thing they're doing is what they call technological warfare. The phrase they have for this is surpass you at the turning point. In other words, looking at next generation technologies in order to start building the next generation technologies, buying up companies, acquisitions, hiring researchers, foreign experts to go to China or stay in place and work on what they're doing for the interests of the Chinese Communist Party, buying off U.S. professors and people at think tanks and different research centers to make it so they start funneling their research to China, launching cyber attacks to steal it by force, you name it. All of this is part of the Communist Party's unrestricted warfare doctrine. And this, folks, is what conquering, what warfare looks like in the current time we're in. This is what modern warfare looks like. And again, what is one of the basic doctrines of communism, right? Seize the means of production. Seize the means of production. Which country controls the world's factories? That's your productive power. Which country controls the factories? Which country controls the natural resources for those factories? Which country controls the natural resources, the oil, the minerals, the timber? Which country controls these? Which country controls the marketing? Which country controls the innovation side of it? Which country controls the transactions, the payment side of it? Transaction warfare, outlets like like, for example, platforms like Alibaba or Amazon would be forms of transaction warfare. The CCP is building the copies of them. All of this, folks, I'll tell you, if the Chinese Communist Party doesn't already control it, they're trying to. And for them, this is warfare. In their own words, openly stated, they don't even try to hide it. They call this unrestricted warfare. That is the phrase they use for it. And again, they're not they don't even try to hide the fact that they regard it as waging war against the United States. They talk about it openly. It's just most folks never talk about it. Most folks here never talk about it. All right, folks, that said, not to terrify you all, not to terrify you all in this, I can tell you from my perspective, and I'll go into some more stories in a bit, but from my perspective, I've been watching this for a long time. As have folks like Peter Navarro, who was one of Trump's main advisors and who really formed a lot of Trump's policies against the Chinese Communist Party. Prior to Trump, to be honest, from my vantage point, and I've been working on this beat since 2008, personally, I didn't think much could be done about it. It was far enough along, there were enough arms to it, and frankly, enough people in this country and many other countries, whether it's politicians, journalists, academics, you name it, have already been bought off or subtly controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, that it's very hard to unravel. But really, I think Trump showed very quickly that it can be unraveled. And in fact, his policies really had the Chinese Communist Party hanging on by a thread. Biden is now reversing a lot of that, although he's keeping the sanctions in place. He's not putting the same pressure that Trump put on them. He believes things can be done diplomatically. And for the Chinese Communist Party, they have no problem signing an agreement and violating it because, it's going to take 4, 5, 6 years, maybe even longer for the audit process and for the renegotiations to take place before the U.S. finally just says, forget it and pulls out completely. They don't care. They'll sign anything that comes to the table. They don't care, right? Because they can violate it. And then who's going to hold them accountable, right? That's their thinking. But really, it can be undone very quickly. If Biden were to take a stronger stance, if he were to have, basically say, okay, diplomacy is no longer working. And keep in mind, even Trump, even though he was pretty hard on them up until last year-ish, when the pandemic hit, Trump was still talking about trade deals with China. He was still talking about negotiating with them. It was only when he saw them launch their wolf warrior diplomacy policy, where they were getting, going and threatening U.S. allies and so on, threatening Trump, threatening Pompeo and so on. It was only when that started happening that I think a lot of world leaders saw the real face of the Chinese Communist Party and began taking a much harsher stance with them, abandoned a lot of the diplomatic engagement policies they've been trying. Now, Biden's coming onto the scene, and he's basically back where a lot of countries were, 3, 4, 5 years ago. He's trying to basically continue things the way Obama was doing it, which was not working. And unless he engages them very strongly, the Chinese Communist Party is going to continue advancing its movements during this time, pretty much as they have been, right? But as soon as someone else comes into power, whether it's Trump or someone else, those policies could change very quickly. And as we saw again last year with the Chinese Communist Party and the virus outbreak, when Australia, for example, called for investigations of the origin of the virus and the Chinese Communist Party threatened Australia, when news of the Muslim Uyghur slave camps became public, when the genocide of the Uyghurs was finally declared a genocide, and maybe many other genocides in China will soon be declared genocides as well officially, because there are many. Really, it only takes one moment for countries to turn around. We saw Germany turn around a bit. We saw Australia turn around a bit. We saw Japan and India turn around pretty strongly, actually. Things can turn around very quickly. And it only takes that one moment for people to realize what's happening, for that to happen. And again, we'll have to see who's in office in 2024. If it's Trump, very likely he's going to toss out Biden's diplomatic engagement policy with China and begin hitting them very hard again, which, again, the Chinese Communist Party is actually very weak right now. If it were to be taken care of through Trump's approach, you might remember, folks, last year I said I don't even see the CCP surviving. I thought the regime was going to collapse by this time. Policies have breathed new life into it, but it's still very weak. And so even though they're doing this, even though they're pushing forward with it, even though they do have a lot of international control, it's a paper tiger in many regards. It's a glass cannon. It has a lot of firepower, but behind it, it's very delicate. And so where things are at currently. Now, that said, folks, let's go into one last story for the night, because I want to talk about Fusion GPS and the whole Trump-Russia scandal and the disinformation on that, including new information on who was financing the whole thing, who was behind the Trump-Russia scandal, right? One of them was Soros, it appears, or at least his organizations. Other folks as well. I'll go into it. Now, Epoch Times reports this. It says billionaire-backed operative kept funding Steele and Fusion GPS in 2019. Christopher Steele was the former British spy who authored that, collected the claims he made in it, which have been proven false or are totally unverified. Even the FBI never verified them. Even he never verified them. He collected that information from Russian sources, meaning that the document that was used to try to paint Trump as a Russian agent was itself a form of Russian disinformation. Never verified, fed to our government, fed to our media, and used by our intelligence agencies to spy on the president of the United States, Trump, at the time. And also Fusion GPS, the company that was part of that. And that was even after the dossier's credibility crumbled. They continued to finance that disinformation operation even after even after the document was exposed of what it was, which was disinformation. Epoch Times reports this. A former staffer of Senator Dianne Feinstein, the individual who had the driver who was a Chinese spy, you might remember, continued to pay large sums of money in 2019 to former British spy Christopher Steele and Fusion GPS, the firm that retained Steele for work on a Hillary Clinton-funded misinformation dossier, even as the credibility of both Steele and the claims of his dossier evaporated. The Democracy Integrity Project, also called the TDIP, again, the Democracy Integrity Project, a nonprofit operation operated by former Feinstein staffer Daniel Jones. And Daniel Jones, remember that name because he plays a few times into what we're going to go into. Daniel Jones, right, running the Democracy Integrity Project, and a former staffer of Dianne Feinstein, maybe alongside this driver she had who was a Chinese spy, paid $1.22 million in 2019 to a company called Bean LLC. Now, the shell company, Bean LLC, controls Fusion GPS, and $700,000 to Washingham Partners Ltd, a British company co-owned by Steele, Christopher Steele, the former British spy who did a lot of this, according to a tax filing. Jones continued to fund the firms despite revelations in 2018 and 2019 that severely undermined the credibility of the dossier and its author. Now, I won't go into debunking the dossier because we talked about that quite a bit, and I'm sure you folks have seen by now at least our articles debunking the dossier and how the whole thing fell to pieces and how it was really a disinformation campaign. Ironically, anybody who questioned it was criticized of pushing disinformation, right? It says here, continuing a bit further in the story, despite its hard-hitting report on news knowledge, because the New York Times actually exposed New Knowledge, which is an organization tied to Jones, the New York Times actually was repeating some other disinformation. The New York Times fell for a Jones disinformation operation earlier this year. Jones was behind this possibly as well, publishing an article about the Epoch Times, the media I work for, sourced solely to Advance Democracy, Inc., another U.S. nonprofit operated by Jones that had also funded New Knowledge in 2018 and 2019. All right, it's all coming together, folks. The same folks attacking us tied to this organization, which New York Times was reporting on without actually verifying the information. New York Times spread disinformation against the Epoch Times, an information they never even verified, which was fed to them by Advance Democracy, tied to this organization run by this guy, Jones, who was the main figure behind financing the Steele dossier and Fusion GPS as it went forward, right? Go into a bit more. Now, Jones used two of his nonprofits to pay New Knowledge $665,000 in those years, according to tax filings. The legal name for New Knowledge is Populi Inc. The company has since rebranded itself as Yonder. Kind of funny to keep changing names, huh? Now, in 2017 and 2018, Jones used his two nonprofits to funnel more than $5.3 million to Fusion GPS, the organization that was running put out the Steele dossier, right? And almost $1 million to Steele, that former British spy who did that. He told the FBI in March 2017, get this, that billionaire financer George Soros and a group of 7 to 10 Silicon Valley billionaires funded his Trump-Russia operation to the tune of $50 million. You hear that, folks? 7 to 10 Silicon Valley billionaires. We don't know who they were, but think about how many billionaires there are in Silicon Valley and which ones of them might have been involved in creating disinformation to go after Trump, while at the same time, different Silicon Valley platforms were censoring anybody who challenged these narratives, right? These individuals and George Soros, according to what he told the FBI in March 2017, were financing this operation with $50 million. He offered to give his findings to the Bureau, the FBI, and, quote, planned to share the information he obtained with policymakers and with the press. This is according to the Democracy Integrity Project. That's a quote from the document. Now, the Democracy Integrity Project, the other folks tied to this whole disinformation campaign, received $1.5 million from a subsidiary of Soros's Open Society Foundations. And so Soros playing a few roles in this, according to the foundation's website. Now, the project received $2 million from the Fund for a Better Future and also $500,000 from the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. And so, folks, if you have friends who still believe that Trump was a Russian asset, if you have friends who still believe that narrative, or they think that Trump colluded with Putin and was Putin's lapdog, whatever they were saying it was, they were lied to by an actual disinformation campaign that was being funded by the billionaires, right? Folks who claim that the billionaires are the enemy, funded by these billionaires pushing this campaign, which was a disinformation campaign, lying to the American people, pushing false information to our politicians, to our policymakers, to our intelligence agencies, and to our media, misleading this entire country during an election period, especially doing the same thing they criticized Trump of doing and criticized Russia of doing, which was, again, using Russian disinformation because the Steele dossier was collected from Russian sources, which were never verified, using Russian disinformation to interfere in the 2016 elections. And at the same time, using that disinformation they created, these billionaires, including Soros, and 7 to 10 Silicon Valley billionaires, using that disinformation they created and the ongoing project from it, because they continued it, to continue targeting Trump with these false narratives. Now, take it for what it's worth, folks, but it seems to be the case that a lot of what people believed, rumored had happened, did in fact happen. And we'll have to see what information comes out from this. Now, I just went over a small part of that story. It's actually a very long story. If you do want to read that story, it's on the Epoch Times website. It's called Billionaire-Backed Operative Kept Funding Steele, Fusion GPS in 2019, even after dossier's credibility crumbled. So you can read that article in Epoch Times. And folks, that said, we'll call it a night here. Now, as always, I mentioned we are totally demonetized by YouTube. And so if you want to support Crossroads, again, please check out epochtv.com, EPOCH-TV.com. Please support us there. If you want to go the extra mile, please tell a friend or a family member about Epoch TV. We're working to bring on several more shows as well on Epoch TV. Some great stuff in the works. We're also hoping to have a live function soon, so maybe we can, be totally off of YouTube. We'll still be on here to an extent, but totally not having to rely on YouTube by that point. And folks, help us make this dream come true. Help us make Epoch TV the future of journalism. So again, please check out epochtv.com, EPOCH-TV.com. And if you want to go the extra mile, tell a friend or family member about it. Help us get the word out on this. That said, folks, as always, appreciate all of you. Always enjoy talking with you all. I do these live Q&As every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. So I'll see you again this coming Thursday at 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Also, check out the interviews we have. Mary Graybar again on Epoch TV. As always, folks, again, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.
I've been living my life from when I'm 11 years old, inside to the belly to the monster. In 1959, the revolution went. Castro was fascinated. He said, I want you to be the organizer for my army in the future. He pulled out his briefcase, full of weapon, gun. This is for you. You're going to be the commander, the supreme commander to my forces for the future. Che Guevara takes me this morning to the building where they're training all the people, the executives. They're going to take over not only the phone company, the electrical company, and they're not going to stop a country with Che Guevara until they take even the hot dog stand. If this happens, my father is going to lose everything he worked all his life. My father. And I say, oh my God, what we've been doing. I tell my uncle, I live in Cuba. I say, why you live in Cuba? Don't leave Cuba. Stay with us. We will train you, and you want to be the best, to the best that we have.
So who did your uncle work for?
I believe CIA, Mossad, everywhere, intelligence community. I come to be an intelligence source to the West. So powerful